Hello friends, welcome to NoteKode. In this session, we will be discussing about exception handling in Java. What is exception handling in Java? Before that, we need to understand what is exception. Exception is any abnormal condition that disturbs the normal execution of a program. Suppose a program is normally executing and suddenly there is a piece of a code that leads to the sudden termination of that program. So you can say an exception is being encountered. In that condition, we need to handle that exception so that a program could terminate gracefully. For that, exception handling is introduced. Exception handling is the way in which a program can be terminated gracefully. Exception superclass throwable. Let us understand throwable class hierarchy. Throwable is a class of all the exceptions and errors. Exception is a subclass that extends the throwable class. So we can say throwable is the superclass of all the exceptions and errors. Now exception is further divided into two parts. First, compile time exception and runtime exception. As the name says, compile time exception will appear at the time of compilation and runtime will appear at the time of running the program, when JVM will be actually allocating the memory. So errors are caused by the environment in which our application is running. It can be memory out of bound exception or stack overflow or the virtual when our JVM get crashed. So error will appear in that case. So this is the basic hierarchy of exception, where throwable is the superclass, the subclass exception and error both extends throwable class. Exception is further divided into compile time exception and runtime exception. Now type of exception. There are two types of exceptions: compile time exception or checked exception, runtime exception or unchecked exception. What is compile time exception? All exceptions that appear at the time of compilation are known as compile time exception or checked exception. They are called as checked exception because compiler checked this exception while compilation process. Now examples are file not found exception, class not found exception, IO exception, interrupted exception, and SQL exception. Let us understand these exceptions. One by one, we will learn compile time exception and runtime exception. So let me say compile test. Okay. Now I'm creating a main method. Okay. So compile time exception are those exceptions which occur at the compilation time. So let me take an example of file reader. So what I have done in this statement, I have created a new instance of file reader class. So I'm reading a file, notecode.txt file, right? And below that, I will create buffer reader object. Buffer reader. Buffer reader is a class that reads the file. Okay, sorry, please keep this file name instance. Okay, now I'm creating a loop. The file should be a buffer reader pf dot read line is not equal to null. So just understand this is a simple loop that will go inside the NoteKode file and it will read the line by line if the line is not null. So what I want to do, I want to simply print it. bf dot read line. Okay. What I'll do, I'll save this program and let us check what the output comes. Now, once you save this program and run, look at the output console. Exception in the thread main java.land.error unresolved compilation problem. First exception it is showing is unhandled exception type file not found exception. Second, unhandled exception type IO exception. And third also IO exception. Now the first exception, file not found exception, is coming from this line. It's saying file reader is unable to allocate this file. This file path is not present. So this is giving file not found exception. Now with buffer reader, what I am trying to say, I'm trying to read this file. So this line bf dot read line is throwing I exception because reading or writing both are input output operation. So I'm reading here reading line from a file. So it is trying to read the file which is not present. That is why IO exception. Again, it is throwing IO exception is by this. Now this is the example of compile time exception. One more exception I will show you here. Let me create a thread. New thread. And I want to sleep this thread. We call the sleep method. 2 seconds. Again, I will save this program and try to run. Now, what I am getting as a fourth statement, unhandled exception type interrupted exception. Now the sleep method is throwing interrupted exception. Right? So these all are the compile time exception appears while compiling of this program. What is runtime exception? All exceptions that appears at the time of running the program are known as runtime or unchecked exceptions. These exceptions are called unchecked because they are not checked by the compiler. Example, array index out of bound exception, arithmetic exception, null pointer exception. Now let us understand these exceptions. Let me create a new class here. Runtime test. Okay, I've created a new class and main method. Okay, so we will check the first example. I'll show you arithmetic exception. So arithmetic exception, if I say int x is equal to 20 divided by 0. Now simply I want to print this. Let us see how Java handles this. Okay. Now try to save this program and run. As soon as you run, check the console. It says exception in thread main java.land.arithmetic exception divided by 0. So arithmetic exception is the runtime exception that is thrown whenever it is encountered divided by 0. So this is the example of arithmetic exception. Now let us understand the second piece of code. Let me show you array index out of bound exception. Let me declare an array int, comma 2, comma 6. Okay, I just want to check the a dot length. Okay, whenever any exception is encountered, the statement below will never execute. So this exception has already occurred here, so the control will not be shifted to these statements. Let me run and show it to you. Now, by running this program, you will check that only this exception is thrown. The control did not shift to these lines. So at runtime, whenever any exception is encountered, the statement below it will never execute. That is why it is necessary to handle these type of exception. So what I'll do, I'll just comment it and just show it to you. Okay. Now I have commented and I'll run just run it and you will see. Okay, it's printing the length of this array is 3. Now what if I want the element at 4th position? Save and run. Now as soon as I save and run this program, the console is showing exception in the thread main java.lang.array index out of bound exception 4. Because this statement is trying to access the element at the index 4. Because the size of the array is only 3, the element 4 does not exist. So it is showing array index out of bound exception. This is also runtime exception. Now let me comment this and save. Let me show you null pointer exception also. So it will be 3 null pointer. Say if I create a string str and I assign it value null, right? And I just simply need to print out str.toString. Save this program and try to run. Now, as soon as you run this statement, you will see exception in the thread main java.land.nullPointer exception. This is also a runtime exception when any null value is assigned to any object. What is an error? Errors are caused by environment in which we are running our application. Example, out of memory and Stack Overflow. Out of memory errors are basically caused when there is no memory present for the object allocation, or we can say the memory has been exhausted. Similarly, when there is no stack available in the JVM, Stack Overflow error is thrown. Thank you friends for watching this video. Stay tuned for the next session on exception handling on Java Part 2, where we will discuss in detail how to handle exception in Java by using try, catch, and finally block.